Coffee with Coker is a healthcare business podcast from the Coker Group that focuses on solutions to help healthcare organizations effectively navigate the changing healthcare industry landscape.
Welcome back to another episode of Coffee with Coker. My name's Mark Rybolt, and I'm the host of the podcast. And we just want to thank everybody for listening to today's episode. And this is the first recording that we've done of 2022. So we're starting off the year strong. Today's topic is one of those we've had in the works now, and we've talked about it for literally a couple of years now. But just to jump right in, we're talking about compliance today, specifically compliance program risk assessments. Joining us, we have Roz Cordini, who runs Coker's coding and compliance service line. And we have also joining us one of her teammates, Rob Mendoza, who we want to welcome. It's Rob's first time on the Coffee with Coker podcast. And so we're excited to be talking about this topic, as it seems like each year compliance becomes more and more of a very prevalent topic, not only for hospitals, but for medical groups and owners and operators of healthcare services entities. But it's not just that it's a prevalent issue for them. It's definitely one of those things that continues to evolve. It seems like as each year passes, even as some of the different politics ways in Washington, some of these things can tend to either change or require updates or new developments. So we definitely, this is one of those topics we absolutely have to stay on top of for our clients. And we're doing more and more work in this area. So I'm glad Roz and Rob are with us today to talk about compliance program risk assessments. And so I guess I want to jump right in, and Roz, maybe I'll let you start and just talk about why compliance programs are so important, and even kind of the impetus of these topics, of these types of programs that we've been doing work for a few years now with clients. Why are they so important?
Oh gosh, there's a lot of reasons why compliance programs are so important. And most of us in the healthcare arena understand the enforcement environment that exists right now, and has really for a long, long time, with governmental investigations and audits, along with other payers who are doing a lot of audits and investigations. But if we step back and we think about compliance programs and how the concept originated and when it originated, it's been around for a really long time. We've had the federal sentencing guidelines for decades. We have had the Office of Inspector General Compliance Program guidance also for decades in a variety of healthcare settings. And what we got most recently, which really underscored the importance of compliance programs, was in 2017, the Department of Justice's guidance on the evaluation of compliance programs. And so all of that put together really comes down to why we have compliance programs. And fundamentally, it's so that we stay in line and adhere to all of the rules, regulations, laws surrounding healthcare programs. But in addition to that, organizations who have effective compliance programs in place really are setting that tone within the organization of how important compliance is, promoting honest and ethical behavior of employees and providers, certainly protecting against fraud, waste, and abuse, which is, of course, the government's lens as to why compliance programs are so important. And we do that really just to avoid penalties, avoid not just financial penalties, but also other types of penalties that get imposed, like exclusion, reputational harm, and things like that when things go wrong. But fundamentally, to be successful as an organization, you have to have a solid compliance program in place. And the risk assessment that we're going to talk about today is really the foundation of an effective compliance program.
Yeah, that's great. And since we're talking about compliance programs, Rob, maybe I'll let you jump in and talk about what is a compliance program, and some of the key criteria. I mean, this is work that we do with our clients. Sometimes it's starting with building a foundational compliance program, or sometimes it's enhancing an existing one, or going in and dealing with issues that may come up for whatever reason in their previous programs. But just talk about some of the criteria of what we see or what we suggest and recommend in a well-designed compliance program.
Yeah, you bet. So I guess what comes to mind for me, when I think of a well-designed compliance program, is what probably most people listening have heard of, which are the 7 elements of an effective compliance program, which were originally promulgated through the federal sentencing guidelines years ago. And then, further expanded upon by the OIG through multiple, guidance documents, by the OIG, as I said, and for a variety of different entities, everything from hospitals to physician practices to even third-party, medical billing companies. So the 7 elements are really, a big and important component of a well-designed compliance program. And I'll just and oftentimes, they will pull out an 8th element, and that would be the risk assessment. So certainly these elements of an effective compliance program can be sort of labeled or described differently. But I'll just kind of run through them quickly here as to, kind of, again, based on what the OIG sort of labels them and defines them as. And the first one would be high-level oversight, with, having a compliance officer, a compliance committee, of course, having board oversight of the program. The second one would be having written policies and procedures, also having a code of conduct or standards of conduct. The third one would be effective training and education that must occur throughout the year for all staff. The fourth one would be effective and open lines of communication, which involves having, a variety of reporting options for your employees to report concerns, and they need to feel that they have, that level of trust to where they can report concerns or compliance issues without fear of retaliation. And oftentimes this element includes having an anonymous reporting feature, such as a hotline that might be administered by a third party. A fifth element would be internal auditing and monitoring, which is certainly huge, and it's critical and needs to be ongoing throughout the year. The sixth element would be having an investigation and response process, one that is prompt, one that is consistent. The seventh element would be consistent enforcement through, well-publicized disciplinary standards. And that consistent enforcement is key. You can really undermine your compliance program with this element if you're not consistently applying corrective actions to individuals within the organization. And of course, the classic example would be where a high-level person does not receive the same sort of discipline as a lower level person, so to speak, would receive for the same or similar offense, if you will. So that consistent enforcement is huge. And then, those are the core 7 elements. And then, like I said, oftentimes the 8th element is referred to as the compliance risk assessment, which is certainly the topic of our podcast today. So we can kind of get into that as we need to here.
What I wanted to jump in and just refresh everyone's memory about is what the Department of Justice actually said about risk assessments for compliance programs, because I think it sets the tone for the remainder of our podcast and why we're even doing this. But if you recall back in the 2017 guidance, which was updated several times, most recently in 2020, the Department of Justice has set out its framework for if it goes in on a criminal investigation, what are we going to look at? And it put out 3 questions that it reviews as it evaluates these programs. And the first question relates to, is the corporation's compliance program well designed? And that's really where the whole concept of the risk assessment comes up. Because in the DOJ's guidance, they talk about the risk assessment being the starting point of an evaluation of whether or not the program is well designed, because it wants to know how the organization it's reviewing approached its focus for compliance throughout the organization. And they want to know how they came up with their risk profile. And based upon that risk profile, they want to understand the resources, both financial, personnel, et cetera, that were put toward those higher risks that the organization self-identified. And it's important for for organizations to have that risk assessment completed for this purpose, because the DOJ is pretty clear that, we're not going to catch everything in a compliance program. But if we're focused on high risks, we're doing what we can to focus on those. And if something happens that wasn't on your high risk list, the guidance says we're not going to necessarily hold that against you if you didn't identify that as a risk. What we want to see is that you responded to the issue as it came up and really updated your risk profile. So when we say the compliance program risk assessment is foundational, it really is, because it sets the tone for everything you're doing, for the work plan that you set out, et cetera. And so that's why it's such an important focus that we have at Coker when we are addressing compliance issues and situations for our clients.
Yeah, well, let's jump into that, because I'm glad you clarified that. It actually tees up my next question. Before I do that, I should have mentioned when we started off here that we're covering a lot of information here from a relatively high level. If folks are interested in getting more in the weeds on this, obviously they can reach out to Roz and Rob, but also that we have an article that will be coming out very similar time frame as this podcast recording is released. So there's an article that Rob wrote that goes into these 7 criteria as well as the risk assessment in more detail. And so if folks are interested, they can always refer to that for a little bit more information. But let's talk about, especially for someone like me, where compliance is not my specialty. Start with what exactly is the risk assessment, and then with that, I'm curious to know, if we're working with a client and they haven't performed one of these assessments, what do they do? Where do they start? Where do they go?
Yeah, you bet. So I would say if they have not completed or performed a compliance risk assessment, really it should be made a priority sooner than later. As Roz alluded to, it's such a critical part of a compliance program, but it is also very critical to the success of the organization. So obviously you're going to be identifying risk and addressing that risk, the compliance risk assessment. But I would say that it is arguably one of the most important things a compliance officer might do, because again, it feeds your work plan. It's going to kind of drive what you're going to be auditing and monitoring throughout the year. And just ultimately, it's just going to be pointing you in the right direction to mitigate risk. So, when we're talking about what exactly a compliance risk assessment is, that's certainly a good question, because it can be kind of a confusing topic, or it can be misunderstood for sure. Well, I like to start off by saying, what is not a compliance risk assessment, and kind of rule some of that out. A compliance risk assessment is not an audit. It's not any kind of an internal investigation that compliance would conduct. It's not a compliance program effectiveness assessment. Sometimes there could be some overlap between a compliance program effectiveness assessment and a compliance risk assessment, but they are certainly 2 different efforts. It's not a security risk analysis. Oftentimes when people hear a compliance risk assessment, they oftentimes might think it has to do with HIPAA. And that's a separate animal in and of itself there. And then finally, I would say it's also not an enterprise risk assessment. Obviously an enterprise risk assessment is much broader. It's going to be looking at a full range of business risk, whether it's strategic, operational, financial, reputational, that kind of thing. So those are not compliance risk assessments. What a compliance risk assessment is it's really just a structured process for identifying, assessing, and prioritizing legal and regulatory risks that could negatively impact the organization. And they ultimately will allow an organization to focus important resources on those greatest risks, and those areas that are lacking adequate control. So really, the compliance risk assessment just really is focused on the legal and regulatory risk that an organization faces.
Yeah, that's helpful, actually narrowing that down, because all those other types of assessments are very real, legitimate things that are also very important.
Right.
And a number of those things we're involved with doing, I imagine, even in kind of in conjunction or in tandem with the compliance risk assessment. But
Sure.
Specifically to the compliance risk assessment, why should a hospital or health system or medical group or any provider organization, why should they conduct one of these specific assessments that we're talking about?
Sure, you bet. And, a lot of this goes to, the environment that we're in. I mean, we are in such a heavily regulated environment, of course, one where there's always, it seems to be, there always seems to be increased government scrutiny on healthcare organizations. So, these regulations and laws and rules are either, they're constantly changing, or there's new ones coming out, it seems like, all the time. So naturally, that's going to, present more risk to an organization to run afoul of these various rules and regs that are always changing or coming out. And then, so really doing a compliance risk assessment, you're going to mitigate that risk, and you're going to hopefully, prevent or at least decrease any kinds of those fines, penalties, reputational damage that could come about from this tremendous, regulation and government scrutiny. A compliance risk assessment is going to allow an organization to identify blind spots where risks are not being managed adequately, or may otherwise have gone undetected, which of course can result in potentially substantial harm to the organization. And it really, a compliance risk assessment is really going to support the strategy of the organization. That you can utilize the results, the findings, and the action plans of the compliance risk assessment to provide, it can support management and provide managers with critical information on kind of what they're facing as they embark on their strategy and that kind of thing. So, and then I will say the last thing, and certainly last but not least, and Roz has pretty much alluded to this earlier, is that really it's expected. Doing a compliance risk assessment, and this goes back again to the DOJ and their guidance through the evaluation of corporate compliance programs documents that they've issued. It was actually last updated in June of 2020. And in that update, they really emphasized that a periodic risk assessment is a key component of a well-designed compliance program, and that it must be ongoing and timely updated so that the organization's response to new and evolving high-risk areas is dynamic and comprehensive. So,
how often should they be done? Is this something you do and you put on a shelf with just documentation just in case, or is it kind of an ongoing, evolving, dynamic thing?
It is intended to be a living, breathing document. And because it's so important, it really sets your organization's work plan up for the year. So the risk assessment is used to develop the types of items you're going to address, implement, audit, and monitor throughout the course of the year. And to Rob's point, it's not something, you need to do it at least annually. But the whole point is that in being dynamic is that if you create this risk assessment and something happens throughout the course of the year, either something happens or there's new guidance out there, or there's maybe new things on the OIG's work plan that the government's looking at, you may review those issues and say, this needs to be added to our current risk assessment, because you're constantly updating your risk profile. And as things come up, you're going to add them and you might work it into your work plan for the year. So it's absolutely not intended to be put on a shelf, but instead utilized throughout the course of your ongoing work within the compliance program.
That's kind of what I figured. I mean, and it's one of those things that there's a lot of work that goes into it, clearly, and there's a lot of importance behind it. So the last thing you want to do is just kind of treat it as a check the item off the list and move on to the next thing. In terms of the approach, though, I'm curious, are we talking about, are there certain requirements or certain things that have to be done as a part of this specific assessment? Is it kind of, at the discretion of the organization, or is it vary by organization? Talk about the approach a little bit and what the requirements are.
Yeah, you bet. So approaches can certainly vary. That's for sure. They're really, there really is no sort of one sort of correct scientific methodology or approach to conducting a compliance risk assessment. I really like to say that it is more of an art than a science, because ultimately what it comes down to is, the professional expertise within the organization and their intimate knowledge of the organization's, risk tolerance, for example, and how much risk tolerance the organization truly has. So that's just really a big component, if you will, of sort of the whole risk assessment process and getting to that end point where you're going to ultimately determine what risk you want to address. So really more of an art than a science, but I would say there are some common core steps that most risk assessments consist of. I guess I would kind of lump them into 4 steps or categories, and those 4 being the identification of risks, the second one being the assessing of risk or evaluating those risks that you've identified, and then the third one being the prioritization of them, and then the fourth one being the addressing of those risks. So what are you going to do to mitigate the risks that you've decided to mitigate based on your prioritization? So I can kind of get into these a little bit. With identification, you want to consider both internal sources of risk and external sources of risk. So meaning, what kinds of things have been going on in your organization that may have uncovered some risk that you want to look at. And then externally, that's kind of the obvious one with the external sources is going to be the various government types of sources, whether it be the OIG work plan or DOJ enforcement action, things like that. So you want to take a look at those sources as part of identifying and kind of getting your laundry list, so to speak, of risks that may potentially apply to your operations or organization. So kind of once you have that laundry list, if you will, of those risks, then you want to then go into the second sort of step, if you will, and that is to assess those risks. And that's where you get into, scoring them. And this is where, again, there's different methodologies and ways you can do this, but a very common approach is to kind of do a likelihood and impact analysis where you're kind of determining what is the likelihood that an adverse event might occur with this particular risk, given our internal controls that we have right now in our current state. And then what would the impact be too? How you want to score out that impact? Would it be severe? Would it not impact us too much? So you want to essentially score and rank these various risks that you've kind of created and identified in the first step. Oftentimes it's helpful to maybe plot these out on a heat map or a risk matrix so that you have a nice visual that you can use for presenting to management, that kind of thing. Or you might want to just literally rank them out maybe on a risk profile chart. So that's a big part of the whole assessment phase or evaluating. And then the third step, I would say, is where you actually get down into prioritizing them. So you've scored them all out. You understand kind of which ones would probably impact the organization the most and are most likely to occur. And that's where you really want to involve management, maybe executive leadership, in determining, okay, what exactly is going to be our priorities? Because your priorities may not always be literally how they scored out. I mean, and that's again where it comes back to the art more than the science. You may have management that feels comfortable accepting certain high risk for whatever reason, and they want to focus on other risks within your listing or your ranking. So that prioritization step is really what's going to get you to the point where you're then going to say, okay, these are the ones we want to focus on. Now we're going to address those risks. And that's where you're going to develop, again, with management, you're going to determine what the actual action plans or mitigation plans will be to address those risks. And that's also going to be the starting point really for the compliance work plan for the year, or maybe it's an update to the compliance work plan or your compliance auditing and monitoring plan, because oftentimes, these action plans that come about, or the mitigation plans actually are audits that need to occur within the organization throughout the upcoming year. So, you really want to ultimately develop a nice, complete and accurate, and of course, realistic risk assessment report that reflects and addresses the needs of the organization. And they're going to communicate that and of course get approval from executive leadership. So,
well, that's helpful breaking down the steps because, obviously you want to get to that fourth and final step of addressing the risks, but you can't do that without identifying and evaluating them and ultimately prioritizing them. But as you were talking, you alluded earlier to working with the compliance officer, maybe the compliance committee and the oversight that's involved. But as you're going through this, that last point you made as far as communicating and coordinating with executive leadership and other management, I have to think is crucial, because I imagine these aren't done in a vacuum purely with the compliance officer or the committee. This is something that truly permeates throughout the organization, and everybody has to be on board with. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
Yes, definitely.
And I think Rob brought up a really important point, and this topic we're talking about right now is really important, which is that buy-in from everybody, but also how important documenting decisions made. Because you can imagine if you have a nice risk matrix out there and you've got some reds or high risks out there, and a decision is made not to address that risk, you're going to want to have really solid documentation as to why. So, it could be a financial reason. It could be this risk is going to cost the organization a lot of money to mitigate or deal with, and the budget may not be there. The organization might be small. There may be really good reasons for not addressing the entirety of the risk right now, but you're going to want to document rationale behind how you end up with your final list. So that communication and buy-in is just critical.
Yeah, and the documentation as well, because like you said, to your point, Roz, I can't imagine it being a good situation to be in where you have identified some, let's just say, red areas, but then, had no reason for not addressing them. I guess one answer could be, we can't do this right now, say, again, with your example, financial reasons or whatever it may be, but just ignoring them isn't an option.
Right. I mean, you want to at least be able to do something. I mean, most people aren't going to leave a high risk alone. Excuse me. But they may not be able to fully address that high risk, but they may be able to do certain things that would lower that from a high risk to maybe a medium risk in the first year. So you're never going to really ignore anything. But there is rationale behind why organizations choose to do things at certain times. And I think it's just important to make sure all of that is in the file somewhere.
Yeah. And that follow through, again, working with management and leadership, because, we may be able to say, hey, all these things need to be addressed and within a certain time frame and whatever steps that need to occur. But ultimately, the people in that organization, the leadership and the different layers of management are going to have to be involved to determine, is this realistic? Is the timing make sense? Is this something that, we need to ramp up resources for or scale back? Or I just have to think that coordination is crucial.
It is. And most of the time, your executive leadership sits on the compliance committee along with the compliance officer. So you have generally a baseline support of the process from those within the organization who are responsible for setting the tone and expectations throughout the organization.
And then what happens? You talked about this already a little bit as far as documentation and action plans and things. But even as you get through that post assessment step and you're now looking at follow through, talk about briefly, if you don't mind, just some of the things from the implementation perspective that need to occur.
Sure, you bet. So yeah, that's where it could be tempting to say, okay, we've done the risk assessment. Now let's go ahead and put it up on the shelf. We've documented everything. We have some action plans that we want to get to eventually. But that's obviously not what you want to do. So when you get to this stage of the process, it's critical to move forward with, the implementation, of course, of the action plans, and try to move them along so that they are completed within the established deadlines. the compliance officer, along with the compliance committee, typically are continually monitoring, the action plans, and tracking the progress. And sometimes you determine, if resource changes may be warranted to ensure completion by the deadline. Maybe they need to up the resources to that particular, for that particular action plan, or perhaps be quite the opposite. Sometimes it could be, you need to shift your resources to another, high risk, action plan that is at risk of not being implemented. So that ongoing monitoring and reporting of status updates to executive leadership and the compliance committee or the board is just vital to really seeing this through to fruition and ultimately to mitigating that risk that you've identified through the process. So, and then I would just kind of, a final point I will make is just a last point again, like on the documentation. I would agree. It's just, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to document everything from beginning to end, everything from the beginning where you're, determining your methodology, you're identifying your risks, you're going through that whole process. And as Roz alluded to, you're determining which risks you're going to attack and which ones you're going to accept. I mean, that is vital that you get that reasoning behind all of that, and that you've gotten, that approval from whether it be executive leadership or the compliance committee or the board. So vital to do that, to document everything, because you ultimately want to be able to prove compliance, right, down the road. I mean, whether it may be needed to inform business decisions down the road. Or, let's say the government comes knocking, so to speak, because you want to be able to demonstrate again that you have a thorough, comprehensive process of identifying and assessing and mitigating risk, and that you follow through with it. And you have documentation to support that.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And last thing I had here is we bring it kind of full circle. Roz, I wanted to give you and Rob a chance to briefly kind of plug what you guys do. And so maybe if you don't mind, talk about what Coker does as it relates to the compliance risk assessment and how we work with clients. I mean, we've talked about going through the assessment process, but I have to think there's kind of a specific role and reason why organizations reach out to Coker to assist in these processes. Talk about that if you don't mind briefly.
Sure. So we do really full spectrum compliance program work. And so we approach compliance program risk assessments in a variety of ways, depending on how we are working with the client. So in some instances, we might be engaged to come in and facilitate the compliance risk assessment for a program that has not done one, is not comfortable doing one, because as Rob said, because there's no required format out there, it can be a little daunting to do a compliance program risk assessment. So sometimes we'll be brought in to facilitate that risk assessment. And other times we are working for an organization as their virtual compliance officer. And as part of our day-to-day role within that engagement, we perform the annual compliance risk assessment or update it as it needs to be throughout the course of the year. And sometimes, clients reach out or potential clients reach out just for advisory support. So they might engage us as just a compliance advisor and just help them through the process. So there's a variety of ways. And of course, we're compliance geeks and nerds. So we're happy to get involved at any level that somebody needs us. Rob, would you add anything to that?
Maybe the only thing I would add is that, along with, in addition, I guess, to the actual assisting with conducting the compliance risk assessment, we can certainly assist with, the implementation of action plans, of course. And that oftentimes comes by virtue of our virtual compliance officer support or advisory services even. And that is, so again, we can help with literally, whether it be the development of a compliance work plan for the year, an annual work plan, or the updating of it based on results from the risk assessment. Perhaps it could result in some audits and some monitoring, because we do have some coding compliance services that we can do, and we can do coding audits and things like that. So I would say, in addition, like as Roz alluded to, basically, it's a full spectrum of what you would think of as compliance services within healthcare is really what we can help our clients with. Definitely.
That's great. That's really helpful. And again, I want to remind everybody, Rob's article that will be coming out in conjunction with this podcast goes into more depth on everything we've talked about today and more. And then we also have a lot of information as relates to the compliance risk assessments, as well as our other compliance services on our website. So I invite everybody to just feel free to look into that more. But otherwise, Rob and Roz, I appreciate you guys chiming in and talking a little bit about this. There's so much here. Honestly, we could go on and talk for hours and get into a lot more of the weeds, but I think we can at least cover the high level there and kind of take it from there. I know in future conversations, we can dive into more about not only this type of risk assessment, but some of the other assessments that we work with clients on. So thank you guys. And I look forward to continuing the conversation in the near future.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
We hope you enjoyed that episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you for listening. We want to encourage all of our listeners to participate and contribute in the podcast. So if you have any questions on any of the things we discussed in this episode, any of the topics that were presented, please feel free to ask us. Also, we welcome your feedback and suggestions. If you have any ideas related to the material we discussed in this episode, or in any episode, please let us know and we'll make sure to incorporate it. And if you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear more information about in future episodes, please send those suggestions to us. We would love to hear them and we'd love to incorporate them into our future episodes. You can find us online and on social media. Start with our website, and specifically the podcast is coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find that through the main Coker website at cokergroup.com. You can also find us on social media, Twitter at Coker Group, and then on LinkedIn, you can search for Coker Group and find our page and the page for some of our team members as well there. So you can find us and reach out to us in a number of places. And then if you want to contact us directly, one of the best ways to do that, email feedback@cokergroup.com. That's feedback@cokergroup.com. And again, we'd love to get your feedback, and we'd love to encourage everyone to subscribe to the podcast so that you can be notified when future episodes are released. We look forward to the next episode, and we look forward to getting your suggestions and feedback on this episode. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you again on future episodes.